Over the past few hours, the name of Donald Trump has once again moved to the center of the global conversation. But this time, it's not because of just another controversy or a political statement that gets lost in the endless news cycle. This time, what he said carries a different weight, a weight that can be felt even thousands of miles away, because what he delivered was essentially a direct message about the war with Iran. And not just any message. He talked about timing, about weeks, about a possible end in the near future. Yes. Weeks. In a conflict that many expected to be long, complex, and full of uncertainty. That idea alone is enough to raise serious concern, because when someone in his position says a war could end quickly, the first question that comes to mind is the end really that close? Or are we entering a more intense phase? Trump explained that, from his perspective, the United States has already made significant progress in the conflict. He didn't go into full detail, but he made it clear that several key objectives may have already been achieved. In simple terms, the military pressure is starting to work, and this is important to understand. When a government talks about objectives achieved in a war, it usually refers to very specific things: weakening infrastructure, limiting the enemy's ability to respond, controlling strategic points, or reducing their operational capacity. It's not just a phrase. It's a signal that something is happening on the ground. But this is where things become more delicate, because along with that idea of progress, Trump also made it clear that he is not thinking about a traditional exit based on long negotiations or complex agreements. Instead, his message was much more direct. The conflict could end soon, but under certain conditions, and even though he didn't say it in those exact words, many interpreted it as an ultimatum. In simple terms, either an agreement is reached under the conditions set by the United States, or the pressure continues. That completely changes how the conflict is understood, because now it's no longer just about who is winning or losing, but about who can withstand more pressure. And in that kind of situation, tension always rises. At the same time, Trump mentioned something that has sparked a lot of debate. He claimed that Iran may have already shown interest in a ceasefire. In other words, from his point of view, the other side might already be looking for a way out. However, that version has not been clearly confirmed by Iranian sources, and that opens up another layer of the problem: the difference between what is said publicly and what is actually happening behind the scenes. Because in conflicts like this, information is also part of the strategy. Saying that the other side wants to negotiate can be a way to apply pressure, show strength, or even influence international public opinion. And at the same time, denying that information can be a way to avoid showing weakness. So at this point, there is not only military tension, there is also a battle over the narrative. And that is key, because what people believe is happening can influence political decisions, markets, alliances, and international reactions. It's not just communication, it's part of the conflict itself. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is watching closely. Governments, analysts, markets, everyone is paying attention to what could happen in the coming days. Because if there really is a chance that the conflict could end in weeks, that could change many things. But if that speed actually means an intensification of pressure, then the scenario is completely different. And that's where the biggest concerns begin. Because a quick resolution does not always mean a stable one. Throughout history, there have been many cases where conflicts that seemed to end quickly left consequences that lasted for years. Tensions that don't disappear, they just transform. Problems that aren't fully resolved, they simply change shape. That's why, even though the idea of a near end may sound positive, the way that end is reached is what truly matters. Will it happen through a clear agreement, where both sides accept conditions and tensions are reduced? Or will it happen through such intense pressure that one side is forced to give in quickly, but with lasting damage? That is the big question right now. Another point that has caught attention is the level of confidence with which Trump made these statements. It wasn't a message full of doubt or open possibilities. It was direct, firm, almost as if he already had a clear vision of how events will unfold, and that can be interpreted in two ways. On one hand, as a sign of confidence, someone who believes their strategy is working and that the outcome is near. But on the other hand, it can also create concern, because in situations this complex, too much certainty can be risky. Conflicts don't always follow the expected script, and sometimes, small changes can lead to major consequences. There is also another factor that cannot be ignored: the global impact. Even though the conflict is centered between the United States and Iran, its effects are felt across the world. Oil prices, market stability, decisions made by other countries. Everything is connected. Every statement, every move, every signal can influence the global economy and international politics. That's why when someone like Trump talks about weeks, he is not just marking a military timeline. He is signaling a possible turning point for many things. And while all of this is happening, uncertainty continues to grow. Because beyond what is said publicly, there is a lot that we don't see. Negotiations that may be happening in private, strategies that are not revealed, decisions being made far from the cameras. And in the middle of all this, the world is trying to understand what is really going on. For now, the only thing that is clear is that the message has been delivered. And it is not just any message. It is a warning, a signal of pressure, and at the same time, a promise of a possible near end. But that ending has not been written yet. The coming weeks, as Trump said, will be crucial. Not just to see whether his prediction comes true, but to understand what kind of outcome is actually approaching. Because at this point, it's not just about whether the war ends or not, it's about how it ends. And what comes next. And that is what is truly keeping the world on edge. And at the center of that energy is a key point that very few people fully understand, yet almost the entire world depends on it. The Strait of Hormuz. It may not sound that important at first, but it is. Very much so. A massive portion of the world's oil flows through that narrow passage. It's like a global energy highway. Every day, millions of barrels pass through it on their way to different countries. Asia, Europe, even the Americas. All depend, to some extent, on that route remaining open. Now imagine this for a moment. If that flow were to stop, or even if there were a serious risk of it stopping, the impact wouldn't stay in that region. It would be felt across the entire planet. Oil prices would rise. Markets would react. Economic uncertainty would grow. And within days, the tension would become global. That's why when Donald Trump mentions conditions related to the security of that passage, he's not talking about a technical detail. He's talking about the economic heart of the conflict. And this is where everything starts to come together. Because his message isn't just about ending the war. It's also about making sure that energy flow is not disrupted. In other words, ensuring that the world and, especially the United States and its allies, maintain stable access to that energy. But what makes this even more delicate is how it's being presented. This is not an open negotiation. It's not an invitation to dialogue. It's a condition. If the passage is secure, there is a possibility of a ceasefire. If it is not, the pressure continues. Simple as that. And that turns the strait into much more than a geographic location. It becomes a symbol of control, of power, of influence. Because whoever controls that passage holds a major advantage on the global stage. But this is where things become even more complex. Iran is not a passive player in all of this. It holds a strategic position precisely because it sits right next to that route. And over time, it has made it clear that this point is also a tool of pressure for them. In other words, it's not just the United States that can use energy as a strategy. Both sides understand what is at stake. And when two sides recognize the value of the same resource, the risk of conflict increases. Meanwhile, the markets are already reacting. Every statement, every warning, every sign of possible escalation triggers immediate movement in oil prices. An actual blockade doesn't even have to happen. Sometimes, the mere risk is enough to cause shifts. And that affects everyone, from major economies to ordinary people who begin to see changes in fuel prices, transportation costs, and everyday goods. Everything is connected. That's why this chapter matters so much. Because it helps explain that this war is not just about territory or politics. It's about resources, access, control. And at this point, oil becomes a central piece. But there's more. When Trump talks about possible stronger actions if conditions are not met, many analysts believe he's not only referring to continuing traditional military attacks. It could also mean actions directly targeting energy infrastructure. And that is a completely different scenario. Because attacking that kind of target doesn't just affect one country. It impacts the entire global energy system. And that's where the risk truly escalates. Because there's a big difference between a localized war and a situation that directly affects the global economy. That's why every word in this context matters. Every condition, every warning, every move, because the balance is extremely fragile. And at the same time, a question is starting to gain strength. Is the goal really to end the war? Or to redefine who controls what matters most after it? That question is what keeps many analysts on edge. Because if the main objective were simply to end the conflict, the approach would look different, more diplomatic, more open. But when the focus shifts towards strategic conditions like control of energy routes, the entire scenario changes. It becomes deeper, more structural, much harder to resolve. And in that context, time once again becomes a key factor. Because if we are truly talking about weeks, as mentioned in the first chapter, then the decisions made during this period will be critical. Not just for the immediate outcome, but for the global balance in the years ahead. And that's what makes this moment so delicate. Because this is not just a war in progress. It is a struggle for control over something that moves the entire world. And while that struggle continues, the rest of the planet has no choice but to watch and prepare for what may come next. If there's one thing that has become clear at this point, it's that the tension is not only continuing, it's entering an even more delicate phase. Because now, it's no longer just about what Donald Trump says, but about how Iran responds, and how the rest of the world reacts. And right now, that response is not as clear as many expected. On one hand, Trump insists that the conflict could end soon, even within a matter of weeks. But at the same time, from Iran's side, there are no strong public signals that they are willing to accept the conditions set by the United States. There is no official announcement of negotiations under pressure. There is no clear confirmation of a ceasefire on the way, and that creates a very dangerous situation, because when two narratives collide, one saying we are close to the end and the other not confirming it, what truly exists is uncertainty. And in a conflict like this, uncertainty is one of the most unstable factors that can exist, because no one knows for sure what will happen, and that makes everyone prepare for the worst. Meanwhile, movements in the region have not stopped, even if it's not always visible in the main headlines. Military activity continues. There is constant surveillance, strategic deployments, and a level of tension that does not go away. There is no real pause. There is no moment where both sides are clearly reducing intensity. On the contrary, everything seems to be stuck in a very fragile balance. And that kind of balance is dangerous, because it doesn't depend on solid agreements, but on moment-to-moment decisions, reactions, calculations that can change in minutes. And that's where one of the biggest risks in this entire situation appears. Error, not necessarily a major mistake, not a planned decision, a small error, a misinterpretation of a signal, a military move perceived as a threat, a stronger than expected response. In this kind of context, that is enough to trigger escalation. And once escalation begins, stopping it becomes much more difficult. But that's not all. There is another element that is starting to play an increasingly important role. Allies, because even though the main actors in this conflict are the United States and Iran, they are not completely alone. Other countries are watching, making decisions, positioning themselves. Some offer direct or indirect support. Others prefer to stay on the sidelines. And others are focused on something very specific, the economic consequences, because beyond politics or military strategy, there is an impact that is already being felt, and could get worse. Oil. Every time tensions rise, markets react. Prices go up, down, become unstable. And this doesn't just affect large corporations or governments. It affects ordinary people. Fuel costs, transportation, everyday goods. Everything starts to shift, and that creates internal pressure in many countries. That's why some governments are not just watching the conflict for political reasons, but because they know their own economic stability could be affected. And that makes the situation even more complex, because now, it's no longer just a military issue, it's a global issue. Meanwhile, on Iran's side, the stance remains firm. There are no clear signs that they are willing to accept imposed conditions without resistance. And this is important to understand, because for any country, especially in a situation of international tension, showing weakness publicly can have internal and external consequences. It can affect their position, their credibility, their influence. That's why, even if there are private conversations or indirect signals, what is shown to the world is usually a posture of strength, and that keeps the tension high, because if neither side is willing to take the first visible step back, the conflict stays in that uncomfortable space where anything can happen. And this is where the situation becomes even more serious, because as days pass, a possibility that worries many analysts begins to grow, that this conflict may stop being limited, that more actors could become involved, that other countries, directly or indirectly, may be forced to take a position. And when that happens, control becomes much more difficult. History has shown this many times. Conflicts that begin between two actors often escalate when more interests enter the equation. And that is exactly what many are trying to avoid right now. But avoiding it is not always easy, especially when so many factors are involved. Power, resources, influence, economy, security. Everything is connected. And in that context, every decision carries weight. Every word matters. Every move counts. That's why Trump's statements should not only be understood as a prediction or an opinion. They are also a tool of pressure, a way to set the pace of the conflict, a way of saying, time is running, and decisions need to be made soon. But the biggest question still remains unanswered. Will Iran accept those conditions, or will it choose to resist, even if that means prolonging the conflict and increasing tension? That decision is critical, because it will not only define the immediate outcome, it could also shape the future of the region and its impact on the rest of the world. And until that decision is made, or at least made public, the situation will remain uncertain, a scenario where everything seems contained, but where anything can change at any moment. And that is what is keeping the world on alert. Because now, it's not just about whether the war will end in weeks, it's about what will happen during those weeks. But will they be weeks of resolution, or weeks of escalation? Will they be weeks of negotiation, or weeks of maximum pressure? And that difference changes everything. Because at this point, this is no longer just another news story. It is a key moment, a turning point. One of those moments where the decisions made can shape the years ahead. And that is why, right now, the world is not calm. It is watching. It is waiting. But above all, it understands that what happens next could change far more than it seems.